and so it is. Well, happy 4th of July, everyone. Happy Independence Day. I don't know how it is where you were, but we had fireworks central going off in the neighborhood here last night. Where we live in South Carolina, of course, fireworks are not illegal as they are in many other states. And this time of the year, big pop-up tent stores appear everywhere. People buying more fireworks than anybody could possibly need. And they decide to go off and shoot them up. I'm sure tonight there'll be even more, and then they'll be going on for another week or so before people run out. But people are celebrating. People are celebrating. And what we want to talk about today, there's a couple things that come together. And we may not get through all of it today, but they're all tied together. And what we want to first understand is freedom and bondage. Freedom and bondage, or freedom under the law is one way that Dr. Holmes put it, or liberty but not license. Liberty but not license. And I think we need to understand that. We need to have kind of a baseline of what I'm talking about, or what I mean when I'm talking about those things, because that then leads into this idea that the Declaration of Independence, if you read the words of the Declaration of Independence, it is an affirmative prayer. It is a spiritual mind treatment. It is a group of people who have come together collectively, and they have declared their intentions. They declared what they know about God, what they know about God as it relates to them, and then they declared specifically their intention, and they committed themselves to it. And it's still unfolding today. That demonstration of that prayer is still unfolding today. We need to kind of take a step back and look at history and see how magnificent this evolution of human beings' expression of their own freedom, how it's still unfolding. And then that leads us to the next logical step, which is, well, what is the ultimate destiny? Emmett Fox called it the manifest destiny. What is the manifest destiny? Emerson said that there would come a time when human beings will have matured spiritually. My choice of words, matured spiritually. But he said there would come a time when there would be no need for government. Why do we need a government? Why do we need a set of laws? When we are told that the law is written upon our hearts, in our minds and on our hearts. And Dr. Holmes tells us that we don't need anybody to tell us right from wrong, because we already know right from wrong. So what do we need governments for? If all beings on this planet were at a point of perfect love, and I realize that this is utopia, we're going to say, well, my God, we're not there yet. We've got a long way to go, But Emerson says the day will come, or the day may come, when we won't need governments. So if we understand how this thing that we call the law of mind works to produce freedom or bondage, as the quote from Wendy said, freedom is a thing of the mind and bondage is a thing of the mind. If we understand the impartiality of the law, the neutrality of the law, then we can see how the Declaration of Independence placed into motion in that law a spiritual force, if you want to call it that, a spiritual entity. Dr. Holmes talks about, we are letting loose a force. We are directing it. We haven't created it any more than we have created gravity, but we're learning how to use it. We're learning how to cooperate with it. And this idea that you cast your bread upon the waters and it shall return unto you, or in Isaiah it says, my word shall not return to me void. Everything you've ever experienced is a result of what you believe and you have thought, according to Buddhism. As what the mind can conceive, and believe, the mind can achieve. I think that comes to us from Stoic philosophers. We have these little clues throughout history. In Proverbs, we're told, as you think and believe in your heart, so are you. And in New Testament, we're told when you pray believing in your heart, and it shall be done. Not might, not could, not perhaps, but shall. So we want to kind of launch into this celebration of the 4th of July and of Independence Day, and we want to tie these together and bring them back to not just a big picture like the government, the country, the democracy, the republic. But what does it mean to us? What does it mean to us individually? So let's get started here. Freedom or bondage? Freedom and bondage. Dr. Holmes tells us, well, let me back up just a little bit. Let me start just a little bit. In any philosophy or religion that we look at, mostly religions, the theologians have this question that they call the problem of evil. The problem of evil. Now, what is the problem of evil? So the first thing that I want to say to that is, we don't think of evil as an entity. It's not a person. You know, it's not a personality. It's, you know, Sherlock Holmes had his Moriarty. He would Sherlock would read the headlines and say, you know, a school bus went off the road, and he would say, "Does this just happen?" No, somebody had to cause this. It was Moriarty. And we have kind of this thinking that has crept into religious philosophy over the eons, that there is this evil personage that brings about all of these terrible things and causes us to do terrible things and brings this pain and suffering to us and all of that. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about sort of a superstitious belief. I'm talking about this problem of evil, and to describe it as just, evil is things that are not life-affirming, okay? And I realized one day, if you take the word evil and you flip it around and spell it backwards, it's life, live. So anything that is the opposite of living, anything that impedes our full and complete expression of life, we have tended in our culture to label as evil. Evil, you know, bad thing. People do bad things. They hurt one another. They kill one another. They steal from one another. That's evil because it's not life-affirming. And Holmes makes this very clear in his writings, that everything that we do, we wish to be life-affirming. That is the only really moral instruction he gives in all of his teaching. You know, he says, is this thing that you want to do, whatever it is, whatever you're contemplating doing, does it give a greater expression to life and to love and to truth and to beauty? And hopefully you answered yes to one of those. And then he puts in the check. He says, does it harm anyone in any way? Does it take anything from anyone in any way? And if it brings into expression life or love or truth or beauty, a greater degree, and if it doesn't hurt anyone, and it doesn't steal from anyone, take something away from anyone, then it's good. See, then it's good. Do it. And we have to be careful with the word good, because we even have to move away from this idea of good and bad, or good and evil. Because once we call something good, then we have raised the possibility that there is something to the opposite of good. Just like saying, if we have light, there must be dark, right? If it was never dark, would we have a word for light? Would we even care? You know, it would just be. It would just be. We would never think about it. So we have this problem in religious philosophies that start out with the concept that we have been created by a God that is good. God is good, see. And if we have been created by a God that is good, then why do bad things happen, right? So the book of Job in the Old Testament is considered by some scholars to be the first book that was actually written. Not the book of Genesis, which is the way it became arranged, but the book of Job was the first book. And it makes sense to me logically that would be the first book, because it answers a pressing question of the human experience. If God is so good, why do people suffer? Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote a book by that title, and it's his explanation of the book of Job put into modern language. If God is so good, why do people suffer, you see? I think that's the title. It's very close to that. If you look it up, Kushner, Harold Kushner. So religions have to kind of wrestle with this question then of we seem to have come from the source, which is good, but the experience that we have going through life is not always good, not always good. Now, Buddhism addresses this question directly. The first noble truth says, suffering's a fact of life. Suffering is a fact of life. All of life is suffering, see. But then they go on to say, but it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. If we understand the cause of the suffering and we stop doing the things that cause suffering, and then we change our consciousness to the point where those things no longer enter our minds, you see. Freedom is of the mind, bondage is of the mind. Then we can eliminate suffering. We can break the wheel of suffering. We can break out of in the Buddhist philosophy the cycle of reincarnations, where the soul comes back and continues going through a life experience that includes pain and suffering until we outgrow that. And I realize that that's a very, very broad brush explanation of the fundamentals of the Four Noble Truths, but they're worth reading, they're worth studying, and the Eightfold Path, which is the way to avoid the pain and suffering. Sort of like Ten Commandments, but not so much directives of thou shalt not, but it tells you to cultivate right thinking, for example, cultivate right livelihood, these sorts of things. Anyway, I'm kind of going far afield, but it's very important that we wrestle with this question then, which is if this entity, this thing, this personality, this being that created us is only good, and it created us out of itself in its image and likeness, then why does our experience seem to be less than good? And those times when our experience appears to be less than good, we label as an evil, right? So if we come back and kind of look at the explanations that we have here, I think the first thing we want to keep in mind is if you go back and read the book of Job, it talks about Satan a lot in there. And people today equate the Satan of the book of Job with the modern concept of the devil. Right? The devil, kind of the horned creature wearing the red tights and carrying a pitchfork and roasting people on hot coals forever. And that's not what it was, you see. And we're looking at something that was written 4,000 years ago, a different time, a different culture, a different language, and we are trying to assign meaning to it today. And it's not. I mean, just for a minute, I want you to just stop and think about this. So we have the kind of story of Lucifer getting tossed out of heaven. And so Lucifer became the devil. And if you want to know more about that, get Rocco Errico, who makes commentary on the Aramaic translations, and he talks about the difference between Lucifer and Satan and our modern concept of the devil. They're not the same. But if you kind of stay with the story that we commonly have, is that the devil was an angel who rebelled against God, and God cast the devil out of heaven into hell. And if you believe that, then you turn and you open the book of Job, and here we have Satan, who's in heaven with God, who's talking to God, and they're making a bet. They're making a bet as to whether Satan can cause Job to recant his love for God. So how can this be that the devil is so vile and evil that it's cast out of heaven, but now we have him back as Satan, and he's kind of talking to God, and they're having a wager. So there's something different going on there. See, we just have to kind of think about that. There's something different going on there. But the reason I bring that up is in modern day interpretations and in modern day kind of explanations of why does evil exist, where does evil exist, it tends in our country, in the popular background that we have here, it tends to come back to this idea that there is an evil entity in the universe, and that evil entity tempts people and causes people to do bad things. And because Adam and Eve were tempted, the fall of man, or original sin, they were cast out of the garden, and because they sinned, well, everybody else has to suffer. See, that's more or less, again, a very broad brush explanation. And I remember something when this was kind of floating through my head this morning. The comedian Flip Wilson, you know, he used to do, was it Geraldine? Geraldine always would say, "The devil made me do it, the devil made me do it," one of his characters. And one time he said, the devil doesn't have to tempt anybody. He says, the devil's got enough volunteers lined up around the block waiting for directions, instructions, that there's no need to tempt anybody. So keep in mind this idea then in the Christian theology, this idea that all sin originates from the original sin, which is due to the fall of man, which is due to the temptation from, again, Satan, who has been construed as the devil and the evil entity. Now, if we go further east, if we go to India, we start to get a different idea of what this thing called the fall is. The philosophy there also has this idea that there's a fall, but it is not a punishment. It is not a casting out. It is not an act of disobedience that resulted in people being cast out of the garden. But rather the concept that we get from the East is that this perfect intelligence, which we call the divine, or by whatever name we choose to call it, that it made a decision to come into expression through material form and through the various life forms that spring from material, from matter, through the plants, through the animals, you know, and through people. And that as this perfect intelligence cloaked itself into gross matter, dense matter, thick matter, the intelligence that was there kind of became buried, or had, as one teacher, Lori and I studied with, put it, mankind has had ignorance heaped upon it. So he has, and then he chuckled and he winked and he said, but who heaped the ignorance upon mankind and why? You know, always leave him wanting more. He was an excellent man. He's like 92 years old. Dr. Chubb was his name. University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, taught Hindu philosophy. So the idea there is that this fall is not so much an act of disobedience that was punished, but it is the fall of the perfect knowledge, the perfect wisdom, the perfect power into the material expression of the life that is here as we know it. And in that descent, the all-knowingness, the all-powerfulness, all of these things kind of becomes hidden or muted. And in that philosophy, then, our spiritual growth, the spiritual path that we're on, is to rediscover it and to express it in a unique way. And of course, this is exactly what Dr. Holmes is telling us. And he, in fact, read some of the Hindu mystics. He recommends their writings in some of his other works. And I'm certain that, you know, the ideas that I'm telling you that came from the East, that he was repeating them in his own way. So now we are stuck with this problem of evil. And everybody's trying to figure this out. Well, wait a second, you know? And again, I must caution, we have to be careful with the words good. And so if we say that God is good, I would rather say that God is life-affirming. Life-affirming. And that means that it always acts in a manner that is life-affirming. Always. Because as I said, if we label something good, immediately it raises the possibility of evil. If we call something light, immediately it raises the possibility of dark. And because the divine is perfect unity, perfect oneness, perfect wholeness, it is. It is. Right? This is why Moses said, I am gave me the commandments. It is. That's all we can say, it is. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, I am was the highest name for God. I think there was like 13 different names for God, but the I am was the highest. Because what else can you say? I am. Once you start to further define that, you have limited it in some way. If you say I am this, it implies you are not that. You know, if I take a piece of lumber and I make it into a table, well, it's not a chair, it's not a desk, it's not a building, right? It's not a room. It is a table. So once we start to further identify the divine, we are kind of limiting that which is in and of itself limitless. So we have this thing that is, and it is always life affirming, and it has created us out of itself. What is true of its nature is true of us. But because of our ignorance, just lack of awareness, we don't quite understand that. We don't quite understand that. So rather than think of this concept of the devil, which, by the way, most of what appears to us in pop culture about the devil didn't come from the Old Testament. If you go back to ancient Judaism, the concept of the devil as we have it today was not there. It was just not there. Years ago, I was watching Johnny Carson on The Late Show, and you might remember it was an Israeli psychic, Uri Geller, was very popular, and he was on the Tonight Show, and he was doing some kind of demonstrations of his psychic ability. Excuse me, or alleged psychic ability, which depending on the skeptics. But the idea was that there was somebody there, another guest on the show, and this person was made a drawing, and they were concentrating on this drawing. They were focusing on it. And Uri Geller was supposed to read their mind. And he didn't get it. He couldn't get whatever it was. And when they showed him the picture that the person drew was of a devil, you know, like you would see in the cartoons, you know, the cartoon character devil dressed in red tights with the horns and the pitchfork and all that. And Uri said, that's not fair. He said, I don't have any concept of that, because I'm Jewish and we don't have the devil like that. See? And that's the first time I said, well, wait a second, I'd never heard that before. But if you go back into ancient times, this concept of the devil that we have was not there. This concept of a power for good and a power for evil was not there. The scholars say it tended to creep into Judaism after the Babylonian captivity. When the Jewish people were carried off to captivity in Babylon, they were exposed to the ideas of Zoroastrianism, which had a prince of light and a prince of darkness and an eternal struggle between the two, you see? And that's when this more modern concept of good and evil started to enter the culture that has kind of become our background. But rather than having this entity of evil, what we now want to consider is what Dr. Holmes tells us is the law. He called it the law of mind, or the law. Sometimes he just calls it mind, sometimes he calls it soul, but the law. And he got this from Thomas Troward. Now, somebody who watches us on YouTube sent me a message and asked me if we ever talk about Troward, and we will in a couple of weeks when we get through this series here. We will go back and go back to some of the fundamentals of Thomas Troward. I'm giving you a lot of historical context because I really want to bring home this idea that freedom or bondage is of the mind, just as the quote that Wendy gave us. Freedom or bondage is of the mind. So Holmes was raised in backwoods Maine, Bethel, Maine. And he was born in the late 1800s. It was still a pretty rural area. And I've talked to people who've been there, in modern times, and they say the same thing, that it's still a pretty rural area. And fortunately, his mother seemed to have a very open mind. Now, back in those days, before the internet, we had things called TVs, and before TVs, we had things called radios. But before that, people got their information and their entertainment from the lecture circuit. So every town had kind of an assembly hall or a meeting hall, and there was a circuit where these lecturers would just go around. And every week, a different lecturer would appear in town, and people would go and they would pay an entry fee to, purchase a ticket to get in to hear the lecture. And then the lecturer had back of the room sales, book sales, much today, like you go to a seminar today and the speaker's up on the stage and they say, well, if you want to know more about that, pick up like three easy lesson tape back there. It's only $99.95, and or you can buy the whole package for $270 or whatever. But that was how people got information back in those days. And Dr. Holmes, his mother, used to go to these lectures, and she got exposed to ideas that were different than the fundamentalism. Fenwick Holmes wrote a biography of Ernest, and he says there were really only 3 books in the house. One was the Bible, one was an illustrated children's version of the Bible, and the other was called Natural Law in a Spiritual Universe. I think it was Desmond. Desmond was the author of that. Drummond. Thank you. Lori just corrected me. Henry Drummond. Henry Drummond was the author of that. So along the way, Holmes started to read Emerson. He when he was 19, he moved to Boston to take a job with one of his siblings' companies, and he got exposed to Emerson. And he said, reading Emerson, I was taking a drink of cool water on a hot summer's day. He was just so refreshed to know that there was somebody else who believed as he did. And then he got exposed to Christian Science. The man who was his direct supervisor, his wife was a Christian Science practitioner. And Dr. Holmes went and studied with her. And he was kind of trying to put this all together, How does all of this work? When he was a young boy, in the biography, Fenwick also says that when Holmes was a young boy, his father used to take him to church, with the wagon, the buggy and the wagon, the horse and the buggy. And they would go to church, and one day they had a new preacher come through, and he was preaching fire and brimstone. And on the way back home, the father stopped the buggy, pulled the horse over to the side of the road, and he turned around and he said, now boys, he says, I don't want to say anything bad against that preacher man. He says, but I'll tell you this, when he said you're just a worm in the dust, he was flat wrong. So Dr. Holmes, was kind of raised in a home that did not buy into all of the fire and the brimstone and the source of bad things being the sin and the devil and all of that. He had a wider view, but perhaps an incomplete view. And he talks about this in biographies about him, talk about this as he would read different authors, as he got exposed to different things. He studied with the Christian Science practitioner. He studied with Emma Curtis Hopkins. As he studied with these different teachers and explored and read, as they say, he read. In fact, I've got it right here. I'm going to hold it up to you so you can see how thick it is. This is a book on Hindu mysticism that he read called The Life Divine by Sri Aurobindo. I don't know how many thousands of pages it is. It is over 1,100 pages long. He read that as well. But he was still kind of trying to figure this all out. How did this all work? So he found the works of Thomas Troward. So Troward had been a judge in India, a civil judge. He was an Episcopalian, and he always was an Episcopalian, and he remained an Episcopalian. But Troward, being a judge and a lawyer, spoke of things in those terms. And Troward is in some web pages, he is called the point where East meets West. Right? And Troward kind of explained that there's this law. He called it a law just like we call gravity a law. There's this law that responds to us according to our belief. Not our hopes, not our wishes, not our fleeting thoughts, but our beliefs. And Troward said that there's something, this power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief. And that, in Troward's way of thinking, and then in Dr. Holmes, it put together for me, he said, now I understand. This problem of evil that philosophers have been wrestling with for 4,000 years, this problem of freedom and bondage, is a result of this law, this impersonal law. Now you might ask, well, who created the law? Where did the law come from? Well, that's a topic for another day. But just like there is a law of gravity and we don't understand why it works, but we know that it does work, and we know enough about how it works that we can cooperate with it to turn water wheels and produce electricity and do all these other things. Holmes started to explore this idea that there is this law, spiritual law. By the way, a lot of people have read Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich. And in that book, Napoleon Hill said the reason his technique works is because there is a spiritual law behind it. But he would not go into that spiritual law in his book because he didn't want people to think he was trying to convert them. So he said, just accept the fact that there's this spiritual law that works if you use these techniques the way that I give them to you. Dr. Holmes talks about the law. And the law is just very simply, it is done unto you according to your belief. You cast your bread upon the waters, it returns unto you. Your words shall not return unto you void. Everything you experience is a result of what you have thought. As you think and believe in your heart, so you are. When you pray, pray believing in your heart that it is done and it shall be done. All of these different things that you can look through time and you can look through cultures, all of these different things have been pointing to this fact that life, our experience of life, freedom or bondage, is a result of our belief. And again, not just what we think, not just what we hope, not what we wish or will, but what we truly believe, So Dr. Holmes tells us the reason that we are bound or we experience things that are not life-affirming, that's my explanation for what bondage would mean. Things that are not life-affirming, sickness, disease, limitation in the areas of finance or opportunities or love, all of those things that we would look at and say, this is not life-affirming, this is not life-enhancing, this is not giving me a greater experience of the beauty that is here. All of those things are things caused first in thoughts, in beliefs, in our mind. So Holmes tells us the reason that we are bound is because we are first free. We are first free. I'm going to get another drink of water here. I was out mowing the back. 2 or 3 tons of pollen in my lungs, and my throat is feeling it today. So that sounds a little bit, like doublespeak. You're bound because you're free. Well, how can that be? Well, you've seen this in your own life. You've seen this in your own experience or the experience of people around you. We have freedom of choice. We have freedom of will. Right? And if you ultimately go back to the fall of man in Christian theology, in Adam and Eve getting kicked out of the garden, it was because they used their freedom of choice to choose something that they shouldn't have, right? Now again, I'm not saying that they were kicked out because it was a punishment. That is a mythological tale that teaches us values. But it started with the way that they used their freedom of choice. So we have freedom of choice, and we can choose to do things that are life-enhancing, or we can choose to do things that are not life-enhancing. If you've ever had someone in your family or someone you knew who is dealing with an addiction, you have seen it firsthand, you know. Now, what reasonable, rational person would want to go and do something to destroy their health? But we as human beings do. We as human beings do. We do things that are not good for us. We eat things that are not good for us. We engage in activities that are not good for us. So throughout history, there are different stories that are given to us about someone who is locked into a prison cell, and they spend years in the prison cell only to find out that the door was unlocked, or the key was up on the ledge just above the door. And what the teachers are trying to tell us is that we spend our human experience not understanding the power of our belief, not understanding the power of our thoughts and our ability to choose our thoughts. And that is why we experience this thing that we would call bondage. That is why we experience this thing that we would say we have things happen in our lives that are less than life-enhancing. We are bound because we are first free, but we don't know that we are free. We are like the prisoner in the cell who doesn't know the door is unlocked. And in many cases, people go through their entire life, believing that they are victims of their own thoughts. They are victims of their own emotion. And you'll hear people say this, well, I had no choice. I had no choice. Somebody called me a name and I had no choice but to punch him in the nose. I'm perfectly justified. Well, yes, you have a choice. Now, it gets hard. You see, this gets very hard because sometimes we say you had a choice and people say, well, you know, you're blaming the victim here, you know. This person is an addict and you're telling them they have a choice, and it's not that simple. Excuse me, we're not trying to blame anybody any more than if you go to the doctor and let's say you're a smoker, and you go to the doctor and the doctor says, do you smoke? And you say, yeah. And he says, well, how much do you smoke? And you say, well, I smoke about 3 packs a day. And the doctor says, you know, you're going to ruin your health. Is the doctor blaming the victim, or is the doctor giving this person important information that they need in order to experience life to a greater degree? We have to kind of keep that in mind. So people say they don't have a choice, and other people will say, oh, you always have a choice. And then they come right back and say, well, you don't tell me that. I don't have a choice. And we kind of get into this argument, you know, back and forth. Are you blaming the victim or not? And here's where I think this problem comes in. And I'm going to try to bring this section, or at least this part of it, to a close for today, because we're obviously going to have to go on for at least 1 or 2 more weeks to get together all the things that I told you, I promised you I would do. Remember the little illustration you would get when you went to like self-help psychology seminars or read books on self-improvement, and they all talk about the power of the subconscious mind. Right? And remember, we had this discussion many times whether it should be called the subconscious mind or the subliminal mind, because it's not unconscious. It certainly thinks and acts and makes decisions on its own, but the conscious mind is not aware of it. When we were studying Carl Jung a few weeks ago in the Zoom group, you know, he said, you know, the conscious mind cannot know the unconscious mind. So we as human beings don't know our whole self. We only know a part of ourself. We only know the conscious self. We are not consciously aware of what we are unconsciously aware of. More doublespeak. So this idea then is that you see this little illustration of the iceberg, and they tell you that the conscious mind is like an iceberg. It is the tip of the iceberg. It is that 10% of the iceberg that it jets up above the waterline. But 90% of the iceberg is down below the waterline. And 90% of what goes on in your belief system, what you think, what you believe, what you think you know, is churning around at a level that you are not consciously aware of, you see. So people will say, well, I wasn't thinking about getting an ulcer, but I got an ulcer. How does that happen? Well, you weren't consciously thinking about getting an ulcer. But something down below that surface level was churning around, and it produced whatever conditions were appropriate or necessary for that physiological change. So this is why Dr. Holmes tells us never try to do surgery on your consciousness. If something happens, don't waste your time going back in and saying, well, I need to find that exact thought that I had that caused this condition in my life. Because there's a power of mind, or law, the law of mind, that operates according to our belief. And if we accept that, then we can accept that bondage and freedom are an outpicturing of whatever's going on in the totality of our belief, not just in our conscious minds, but in our subliminal or subconscious minds, if you want to call them that, as well. So we now come to the situation where we have these experiences that are less than life enhancing, and we believe, or we're willing to explore, at least willing to become willing to explore the possibility that there is this power of the universe that responds to us according to our belief, that is responsible for freedom or bondage, and we have a choice. But we have to learn how to make that choice, you see. And we have to not, Joel Goldsmith says, don't personalize evil. We have to not beat ourselves up with what I refer to as metaphysical guilt, where something goes amiss in our lives and we think, oh my God, what did I do wrong? I love the way Joel Goldsmith puts it. Beautiful. He says we are all immersed in the consciousness of the human race. Dr. Holmes called it race consciousness. Carl Jung called it the collective unconscious. But we are not that compartmentalized, isolated individual center of thought that the Western world teaches us. But we are all connected, So several people post memes from time to time on the internet about how in the forest the trees are connected below the level of the soil. That there's a network through which they are connected and they can communicate, rough communication, but they are part of a community and they can sense that. So we are all immersed in this murky pool of race consciousness. And in that race consciousness are ideas of the necessity, or at least the acceptance of sin, of sickness, of death, of pain, of suffering, of poverty, and all of those things. It's part of the collective human experience and the collective human memory and the collective human belief system. And what Goldsmith says is sometimes we get a little bit of that on us. So it's useless to kind of say, well, what was I thinking that brought this about? And it's more helpful to say, oh, I got a little bit of humanity on me. I got a little bit of the muck of the universe on me. Now, what would you do? What would you do if you were walking down the street and you inadvertently fell into a big mud puddle, and you get up in the mud puddle and you are just covered from head to toe in mud? What would you do? Well, you'd go find a hose, you see, and you would wash yourself off. And once you got enough of the muck off your clothes, you would probably go into the mud room in your house and take all your clothes off and leave them by the washer and dryer, and you would go jump in the shower and complete the process of washing your body. And then you would take your clothes and you would throw them in the washing machine and you would wash the muck out of your clothes. So I want you to keep that in mind. I want you to keep that in mind for next week. We are human beings. We are human beings here. We are actually spiritual beings having a human experience. And as the Buddha points out to us, and as anybody who can observe points out, that experience is not always, happy-go-lucky, carefree. A Busby Berkeley musical where everybody's singing and dancing. Life is wonderful. Stuff happens, Suffering exists. Bondage exists. But what we want to come to for close today, what we want to come to is I want you to consider for this week, just consider, you don't have to agree or disagree, but just consider, if there is a law of mind that responds to us according to our belief, then freedom or bondage are not God ordained. We are not being tested, we are not being punished. Right? But freedom or bondage or life-enhancing experiences, or experiences that are not life-enhancing, are a result of this power that responds to us according to our belief, operating through our personal consciousness, the consciousness that we possess, which is influenced by and contains part of all of race consciousness. So if you take that as your starting point, then, that the same power that binds us can free us, and the same power that frees us can bind us, depending upon how we use it. And the example I gave in the email last night was the heat on your stove, Because sometimes I say that and people say, well, what are you telling me? God doesn't care about me? I say, no, God cares about us more than we know. It knows us as itself. But it created us to be free, and part of the price we pay for that freedom is we have the freedom of choice, but we have to learn how to use it. We have to learn how to use it. So you can go over to your stove and you can put on the frying pan and you can cook up some eggs and you can have a great breakfast. Or you can go over to the stove and you can turn on the heat and you can put your hand right on there and burn it terribly. Don't do this at home. It's only an illustration. The power of heat, the law of thermodynamics, does not care one way or the other what kind of a choice you make. But it was the choice that you made to either use the heat of the stove in a life-affirming way or one that was not life-affirming. That's what dictated the experience that you had. So you might say, cooking the eggs is freedom and burning my hand was bondage. But those two experiences were the perfect outpicturing or the perfect outcome of whatever drove you to the decision to do one or the other. Now, you may not be aware of why you decided to burn yourself. Psychologists say that sometimes people have these unconscious desires to hurt themselves and all. I don't know about that. But we don't always know why we do things. I do know that. But for today, I'm going to close and invite you to this week, be aware of the circumstances in your life. Be aware of when they are life-affirming and be aware of when they are not so much life-affirming. And ask yourself, is there a way to think or to change your thoughts in order to produce more life-affirming experiences in your life? Next week, I'm going to go into more detail about that. I'm not going to leave you hanging. Right? Change your thinking, change your life. But how do I do that? We're going to go into that. And then from there, what we will lead into how the Declaration of Independence utilized this law of mind in order to produce a new government, a new country, a new way of life. And from there, how does that relate to us as individuals living in the ultimate freedom of no longer bringing into our experience things that are not life-affirming, no longer needing a government to tell us what to do, but to do the things that are life-enhancing, because that is the very essence of who and what we are. So I appreciate you being with us today. for this first part of the talk. There's a lot here. Remember the email I said last night? We got a lot of ground to cover, but this is important ground. Not only do we talk about this law, but we'll look at how that law worked through the proclamation that we call the Declaration of Independence. To not only at that time in 1776, but up to this present day, continues to operate, to evolve, to unfold life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness here in this country. Thank you for being with us. We'll talk to you next week, and so it is.